In 1938, in the northern Spanish region of Asturias, the Calderón sisters entered into an arrangement that was at once startling, practical, and deeply revealing of the era's social conditions. They came to share a husband. For modern readers, the very idea seems to cross an uncheckable boundary. Marriage, by all conventional standards of the time, was meant to be the union of one man and one woman, sanctioned by the church, upheld by local tradition, and strictly guarded by social custom. Yet here, in the middle of the 20th century and in the deeply Catholic countryside of Asturias, two sisters aligned their lives in such a way that they married the same man, not in a symbolic sense, not in metaphor, but in literal and lasting practice. To understand how such a family structure came to be, one must look not only at the unusual personalities and choices of the sisters themselves, but also at the pressures, silences, and compromises of a small community struggling in the aftermath of the Spanish Civil War. The year 1938 was not just any year in Spain. It was a moment when the country was bloodied and fractured. The Spanish Civil War had torn families apart, disrupted villages, and scattered young men. Many had been killed on the front lines or imprisoned, leaving a generation of women in rural areas with diminished prospects for marriage. For families like the Calderóns, who were rooted in the agricultural rhythms of Asturias, survival often required unorthodox solutions. A man with land or means became an anchor of stability, while women with fewer marital options faced lives of solitude, dependency, or hardship. Within this atmosphere, the unconventional suddenly became possible. Two sisters, rather than competing with one another for scarce prospects, accepted the unthinkable, sharing one husband as a way to preserve their family's continuity and secure their place in the fragile economy of rural life. That decision cannot be understood without considering the weight of religious and social expectations. Asturias was and remains steeped in Catholic tradition. The Church's teachings permeated every aspect of daily existence, from the rhythm of feast days to the dictates of morality. In theory, bigamy or polyandry was forbidden, sinful, even scandalous. But the Calderón arrangement did not play out in the open with ceremonial sanction. There was only one formal marriage recognized by the parish registers, one wife on paper. The other sister, though bound just as closely in practice, remained in a gray zone, acknowledged in whispers, tolerated in practice, and accepted within the family circle. For the community, what mattered was less the letter of canon law and more the quiet endurance of village order. If the arrangement did not spill into open disgrace, if it allowed the sisters to raise children and work the land without scandalous quarrels, then it was endured. Silence was a kind of social contract. There is something profoundly intimate, and at the same time deeply unsettling, about two sisters living in such shared intimacy with a single man. They were not strangers, not rivals in the conventional sense, but women who had grown up under the same roof, who had shared the same parents, meals, and childhood experiences. Their decision to intertwine their adult lives so completely hints at a complex blend of loyalty and sacrifice. Did the younger sister accept the arrangement to protect the older from being left alone? Did the elder encourage the younger's entry to preserve family unity and keep land holdings consolidated? The archival record is quiet on such private motives, but oral tradition suggests a pact born less of romance than of pragmatism. Love, if it existed, was transformed into something collective, distributed, negotiated day by day in the routines of shared life. The husband, for his part, occupied an unusual role as well. Far from the stereotype of a domineering patriarch who imposed such a structure, accounts suggest he was more a participant in a negotiated arrangement, himself constrained by the scarcity of the era. His labor was essential to maintain the land, but his partnership with the sisters extended beyond physical work. He became the central figure of a new kind of household, where jealousy had to be suppressed, and domestic responsibilities had to be coordinated in ways that most couples never confronted. Meals were prepared for a collective table. Children raised as siblings not just by blood, but by a confusing blend of maternal ties. In such a household, boundaries blurred. The concept of your children and my children dissolved. Instead, they were all Calderón children, unified under one paternal figure and two maternal figures who were also sisters. The neighbors, of course, noticed. In small rural villages, privacy is nearly impossible, and deviations from custom quickly become topics of gossip. Some would have whispered disapproval, citing the shame of a household that defied church doctrine. Others, however, would have seen the logic, even envied the solidarity of two women who avoided the loneliness that so many of their peers endured. It is easy for later generations to project scandal onto the arrangement, but the truth is likely more complex, a mixture of unease, resignation, and quiet respect. In an age of survival, morality was often bent by necessity. The Calderón sisters' union was less a rebellion than an adaptation, one that allowed their lineage not only to continue but to flourish. The children born of this unusual household carried the imprint of their origins, though perhaps not in the ways outsiders might expect. For them, the arrangement was not an anomaly, but simply the fabric of their daily lives. They grew up with two mothers who were also aunts, with cousins who were also half-siblings. The family tree folded back upon itself, setting the stage for the extreme endogamy that later genealogists would note. Yet within the household, it may have felt normal, natural, even loving. What the wider world might call scandal, the Calderón children simply called family. This first key point, the decision of two sisters to share a husband in 1938, Asturias sets the foundation for understanding the extraordinary lineage that followed. It was not a choice made in freedom from circumstance, nor a gesture of defiance against society. It was, rather, a deeply contextual response to war, scarcity, and the silent codes of rural survival. To modern eyes, it may seem shocking or even impossible. But to the Calderón sisters, it was simply a way forward, a path that preserved family, unity, and created a legacy that, for better or worse, became one of the most tightly bound genealogical lines in Spain. To understand how the Calderón sisters' extraordinary decision could take root, one must step back into the world of Asturias in 1938, a place where tradition pressed hard on every life, yet circumstances forced people into choices that lay outside the prescribed path. The Spanish Civil War was in its final stages, with Franco's forces consolidating victory. Across the country, destruction lingered. Countless young men were dead, others imprisoned or missing, and whole villages had been drained of the energy of youth. Asturias, a mountainous and rural region, had already suffered bitterly during the conflict, with mining communities fractured by political divisions and agricultural families strained by shortages. In such a landscape, the ordinary institutions of stability, church, family, village clung together, yet were tested by the sheer force of survival. This was the world in which the Calderón sisters made their unusual family arrangement, and to grasp its meaning, one must linger on the broader historical and social context that surrounded them. Spain, in 1938, was not simply a country recovering from war, it was a country being remade under the shadow of Francoism. The Catholic Church was elevated to the role of moral guardian of the state, and Catholic teachings penetrated every level of life with renewed force. Women were especially bound by these codes. Their social role was narrowly defined. They were to be wives, mothers, caretakers of the home, obedient to their husbands, and virtuous in every way that aligned with church ideals. Female autonomy, especially in matters of love or marriage, was practically non-existent. Marriage itself was indissoluble, divorce was abolished, annulments were rare, and the sacrament was treated as sacred. Within such a rigid system, deviation from the one-man, one-woman formula was considered a sin of great magnitude. The official line was clear. Anything resembling polygamy, concubinage, or unorthodox unions could not exist within the moral order, and yet rural life had its own quiet. Negotiations with reality. In small Asturian villages, the presence of the priest, the authority of neighbors, and the weight of tradition were all strong, but so too was the force of necessity. Families needed to preserve landholdings, to keep farms productive, and to ensure that daughters did not fall into destitution. The Civil War had robbed many of their options. With so many men gone, women were left facing a stark reality. Either remain unmarried and dependent, or accept arrangements that, though unconventional, allowed them to live with a measure of security. This is the world in which the Calderón sisters' decision can be seen less as rebellion and more as adaptation. Where social structures cracked, families sometimes filled the gaps with silent compromises, and the village often turned a blind eye as long as scandal was kept discreet. The Catholic Church's influence in Asturias cannot be understated, but neither can the way villagers quietly manage their lives outside the gaze of the parish register. A priest might record one marriage, the formal one, and no more. Beyond that, what took place under one roof might be spoken of in whispers, but rarely addressed openly. Rural Catholicism often contained such paradoxes, strict in doctrine, but flexible in the shadows of necessity. It was not that the Church condoned such arrangements, but rather that communities recognized survival demanded a certain elasticity. The Calderón sisters could thus live their lives with a shared husband, so long as one of them was acknowledged as the wife and the other's presence was explained as a sisterly arrangement of care, work, and companionship. The social context of Asturias was further shaped by its geography and economy. The mountains bred communities that were both tight-knit and somewhat insular. Families were bound not just by kinship, but by mutual dependence in agricultural labor. Endogamy, marrying within the same locality or even within the same extended family, was already common, partly to keep land intact and partly because the limited pool of partners encouraged such unions. In this sense, the Calderón case was not an abrupt departure from local patterns, but rather an intensification of them. Their shared marriage was simply a more radical form of the endogamous tendencies already present in Asturian society. The seeds of what would later become the most endogamous lineage were already planted in this culture of proximity and necessity. At the same time, one cannot ignore the broader cultural atmosphere of post-war Spain, where silence and conformity were prized. Franco's regime demanded loyalty, obedience, and the suppression of anything that challenged traditional order. Families learned quickly that survival required not only economic adaptation, but also discretion. Secrets were kept, gossip was controlled, and lives were arranged in ways that did not invite official scrutiny. In such a climate, the Calderón sisters' arrangement could be hidden behind a facade of normalcy. Outwardly, one was the legitimate wife. Inwardly, the reality was more complex. Their children were folded into the same household. The land was worked collectively, and daily life proceeded without drawing official attention. What might have been scandalous in a large city could be absorbed quietly in a small Asturian village, where people knew but did not speak, and where survival softened the edges of dogma. Another important layer to this context was the scarcity of opportunities for women outside marriage. Industrial labor was limited, especially for women in the countryside. The mining industry in Asturias offered some employment for men, but was rarely open to women. Agriculture remained the dominant livelihood, and women's roles within it were extensions of household labor. For a woman without a husband, life was precarious. she might be forced to rely on brothers, distant relatives, or charitable support. The fear of isolation, of being left without means, was real. For the Calderón sisters, the shared husband was not only a partner, but a lifeline against such isolation. In this sense, their arrangement reflects the broader pressures placed on women in Francoist Spain, where economic dependence on men was virtually total. The decision also must be viewed in light of the collective memory of the war itself. Asturias had been a battleground of intense violence, with miners' uprisings and brutal repression. Families lost sons, husbands, and fathers at alarming rates. For the sisters, marrying the same man may have seemed less a breach of moral code and more a continuation of wartime improvisations, when households took in widows, orphans, and displaced relatives to survive. In times of upheaval, lines between kinship roles blurred, and unconventional arrangements became normalized in the pursuit of endurance. By 1938, with wounds of war still fresh, the Calderón's decision would not have seemed entirely outside the continuum of wartime adaptations. Broader society of Spain in this period also played a role in how such a story unfolded. Franco's regime cultivated an image of traditional family values, but in practice, it often ignored the contradictions that existed in rural life. The official rhetoric emphasized order, Catholicism, and morality, yet the lived reality was messier. Many families carried secrets, illegitimate children, hidden political sympathies, unorthodox arrangements that never appeared in official records. This duplicity between appearance and reality was a hallmark of Spanish life under Franco. The Calderón sisters' marriage arrangement fits squarely into this dual world, formally impossible but practically real, morally condemned but socially tolerated, a scandal in theory, but an adaptation in practice, in examining the historical context of the Calderón sisters' decision. It becomes clear that their choice was not a mere eccentricity or personal quirk. It was the product of a deeply structured environment. The demographic devastation of war, the rigid moral codes of Catholic Spain, the economic realities of rural Asturias, the traditions of endogamy, and the culture of silence that pervaded Francoist society. Their lives unfolded at the intersection of all these forces. Without the war, without the scarcity of men, without the church's dominance, without the pressures of land and kinship, their arrangement would likely never have occurred. But with all these elements in place, it emerged as a viable, if unspoken, solution. By situating the Calderón sisters' story within this broader historical context, one can see how their unusual family arrangement was less an act of defiance and more a mirror of their time. Their lives were shaped by the contradictions of a Spain both rigid and adaptable, both deeply traditional and quietly pragmatic. What might seem today like an extraordinary scandal was, in 1938 Asturias, a response to the hard logic of survival, silence, and family continuity. When the Calderón sisters chose to bind themselves to the same man, the immediate consequence was not only the preservation of their own futures, but also the creation of a shared legacy that would ripple across generations. Their decision did not remain confined to the secrecy of their household walls. It materialized most visibly through the children they bore. With both sisters having children by the same husband, the family tree began to fold in on itself, weaving branches that were at once siblings and cousins, sons and daughters of two mothers who were themselves sisters. It was this interweaving that laid the foundation for what would later be studied and remembered as one of the most unusual genealogical cases in modern Spain. But at the time, for the Calderóns, it was daily life, practical, necessary, and quietly revolutionary in its own way. The household arrangement, while unorthodox, was sustained through the children who embodied the shared future of the sisters. These children were never regarded as belonging solely to one mother or the other. Instead, They were all Calderón children, raised under the roof of a single home, eating at the same table, cared for by two women who were equally devoted, though bound by different strands of maternal connection. For the husband, the children represented continuity and strength, a sign that despite the upheavals of war and the silence of scandal, his family would thrive. For the sisters, the children became proof that their pact was not only survivable but fruitful. Their legacy was not just in enduring whispers, but in the laughter and growth of sons and daughters who were bound together more closely than most families could ever imagine. The concept of shared legacy, in this context, carried more weight than it might in other families. Because the two mothers were sisters, their children carried double bonds. They were, biologically, both half-siblings and first cousins. In ordinary circumstances, such relationships are kept distinct, existing in different categories of kinship. But in the Calderón household, those categories collapsed into one another. This collapsing of distinctions created an unusually tight genetic and social knot, one that future generations would continue to reinforce through the patterns of endogamy that already characterized rural Asturias. Thus, from the moment of their births, the children of the Calderón sisters were marked not only by an unconventional family arrangement, but also by a unique place in the village's social fabric. Life inside the household required a careful balance to sustain this arrangement. Child-rearing, which in other families often reinforced the distinction between mother and aunt, here became a shared duty. A child might sleep one night under the watchful care of one sister and the next under the other, with little sense of exclusivity. The children grew accustomed to seeing both women as maternal figures, while the husband's role was amplified as the unifying presence of the household. This distribution of care diluted potential tensions by blurring the lines of who belonged to whom. The family cultivated unity where division might otherwise have torn it apart. It was this unity, more than any official recognition, that allowed their legacy to survive the scrutiny of neighbors and the moral gaze of the church. The shared legacy extended beyond the walls of their home. Villagers, while cautious in their judgments, gradually came to see the Calderón household as a single entity, rather than two competing women bound to one man. The children's presence softened gossip. What began as whispers of scandal slowly shifted into a quiet acknowledgement of fact. The Calderón sisters had children. The children were growing, and the family was strong. In a society where survival and productivity often outweighed moral perfection, the visible vitality of the Calderón children acted as a shield against deeper condemnation. In this sense, the sisters' legacy was not only biological, but also social, gradually normalizing their arrangement within the boundaries of community life. But the very intimacy of the arrangement carried long-term implications for the lineage. The Calderón children, sharing both paternal and maternal bloodlines, embodied an intense form of kinship that would shape the marriages of subsequent generations. Already accustomed to living in a family where boundaries between sibling and cousin were blurred, they entered adulthood in a community where marrying within the family was common practice. Their descendants, marrying cousins or other close relations, amplified the genetic closeness already embedded in their origins. Thus, what began as a practical solution to the scarcity of men in 1938 spiraled into the creation of a lineage so tightly bound that researchers would later describe it as among the most endogamous ever documented in Spain. Yet within the family, this legacy was not experienced as an abstract concept of genetics or lineage. It was felt through relationships, bonds, and stories. The children grew up with a unique sense of solidarity, having been raised in a home where competition between siblings was softened by the fact that both mothers worked in tandem. Instead of rivalry, there was a collective sense of belonging. Their legacy, therefore, was not only marked by the unusual structure of their genealogy, but also by the emotional fabric of their upbringing. They carried forward a sense of identity, rooted in cooperation, resilience, and the silent defiance of convention. The shared legacy also reflects the broader theme of adaptation that ran through the Calderón story. Just as the sisters adapted to the scarcity of men by sharing one husband, so too did they adapt the concept of family itself. Rather than enforcing rigid distinctions of parentage, they created a blended model that defied the categories of church and state. Their legacy, therefore, was not only about the continuation of their bloodline, but about the redefinition of what family could mean in a time of crisis. For their children, this redefinition was not unusual. It was the only reality they had ever known. In this way, the sisters left behind more than descendants. They left behind a model of resilience that future generations would inherit, consciously or not. Looking at this legacy through the lens of time, one can see both its intimacy and its strangeness. Intimate, because it was born of sisters who chose loyalty and sacrifice to preserve each other's futures. Strange, because it resulted in a genealogical tangle that blurred categories usually kept separate. The combination of these qualities makes the Calderón legacy extraordinary, at once deeply human in its tenderness and unusual in its consequences. The sisters, by sharing a husband, ensured that their names and their children's names would not vanish into the silence of a war-torn countryside. Instead, they created a lineage that stood out, both for its survival and for its peculiarity. It is worth reflecting that the sisters themselves may not have thought of their choice in such grand terms. For them, the decision was immediate and practical, grounded in the need to secure companionship, labor, and stability. They may never have considered how their children's children would one day be seen as an anomaly in genealogical studies. They likely thought only of the next harvest, the next winter, the next child. And yet, from these modest concerns, a shared legacy emerged, one that would echo far beyond their lifetimes. Their family became, quite unintentionally, a case study of how adaptation in the face of scarcity can shape not only lives, but entire bloodlines. The Calderón sisters' shared husband was thus more than a man. He was the fulcrum around which their legacy turned. Through him, their children were bound together in ways that multiplied their kinship ties. Through him, their family tree grew not outward into broad branches, but inward, looping back on itself. And through him, their legacy became one of both strength and entanglement, a legacy that remains one of the most remarkable features of Asturias' genealogical history. The unusual household that the Calderón sisters created did not remain an isolated peculiarity contained within the four walls of their home. Over time, the effects of their decision began to ripple outward into the structure of their descendants. Lives gradually shaping one of the most intensely endogamous lineages documented in Spain. What began as two sisters sharing a husband for practical survival in 1938, Asturias evolved into a generational pattern of intermarriage within the same extended family, a folding and refolding of bloodlines that amplified the genetic closeness, already present at the very beginning. To understand how such an outcome took form, one must look closely at both the social customs of the region and the way in which the Calderón family normalized their arrangement, turning what might have been a temporary solution into a defining feature of their lineage. Asturias had long been a place where endogamy was not unusual. Rural and mountainous, its villages were often isolated, and families typically married within the same locality. Land and property were precious, and often small in scale, meaning that dividing them through marriages to outsiders threatened to dilute resources further. Endogamous marriages, whether between cousins, distant relatives, or simply within the same small community, helped preserve family assets and maintain social stability. The Calderón sisters' arrangement intensified this tendency from the start. Because their children were both half-siblings and first cousins, the family tree already contained overlaps that blurred kinship categories. When those children came of age, they were not introduced into a wide pool of potential partners, but rather looked inward, toward their extended family network. The practice of marrying close relations was already present in the region, but within the Calderón family, it became an unavoidable reality. The children of the Calderón sisters entered adulthood in a community where surnames repeated across. Households and genealogies often looped back upon themselves. In such an environment, it was not shocking for cousins to marry. It was almost expected. But for the Calderón descendants, those unions carried a compounded closeness because of their unusual origin. Two cousins who married were not only linked through one side of their family, but in some cases, through both. The effect was to double the genetic weight of their shared ancestry, compressing the family tree even further. What for other Asturian families might have been a modest degree of inbreeding became, for the Calderóns, a defining characteristic of their lineage. This intensification of endogamy was not a matter of abstract genetics for those living it. For the family members themselves, it was simply the way life unfolded. The pool of marriage partners was small, the expectations of marrying within the family were strong, and the legacy of the two sisters' shared household made such unions seem natural rather than taboo. Children grew up knowing their cousins, not only as relatives, but as companions within the same closely bound network. When the time came to marry, choosing within that network felt logical, even inevitable. What outsiders might interpret as extreme endogamy was, from the inside, simply continuity, an extension of the solidarity and closeness that had defined the Calderón household from the beginning. Researchers and genealogists who later studied the Calderón line were struck by just how intensely the pattern repeated. Generations later, the Calderón descendants showed a degree of genetic homogeneity that was unusual even for Asturias, a region already known for tight kinship structures. The sisters' initial arrangement, by collapsing categories of kinship, had set in motion a process that narrowed the family's genetic pool further with each generation. Cousins married cousins, and children were born into a web of relationships where kinship ties overlapped in multiple directions. To trace the Calderón genealogy was to follow a tree that folded inward rather than branching outward, creating what could fairly be described as one of the most endogamous lineages in modern Spanish history. And yet, it is important to see this not only through the lens of biology or genealogical charts, but also through the lived reality of the family. For the Calderón descendants, these marriages reinforced bonds of trust and familiarity. In a society where social change was slow and the outside world seemed distant, family provided security. To marry within the family was to stay close to one's roots, to one's land, and to the values inherited from the sisters who had created the household in the first place. Endogamy was not perceived as an anomaly, but as a safeguard, a way of ensuring that the family remained cohesive and self-sufficient. What genealogists later described with clinical detachment as intensified endogamy was experienced, at the time, as loyalty and continuity. The consequences of this pattern were not only cultural, but also medical, as is often the case with high degrees of endogamy. Over generations, the risk of hereditary conditions grew. Oral traditions within the region hint at certain health issues appearing among some branches of the Calderón line, though such accounts are difficult to verify with precision. Whether or not these conditions were significantly more common, what mattered was the perception. The Calderón name became associated not only with its unusual origins, but also with the peculiarities of its descendants. Villagers sometimes whispered that the family had too much of itself within itself, an acknowledgement that the closeness of kinship had grown remarkable even by local standards. Thus, the legacy of the sisters' choice carried both social admiration for their resilience and unease about the consequences of their lineage. Asterisk. The Calderón case illustrates in stark form how a single decision born of necessity can shape the trajectory of generations. The sisters did not set out to create an endogamous dynasty. They set out to survive, to secure companionship, and to raise children in a time when prospects were scarce. But their children inherited not only their blood, but also the social structure their mothers had created. That structure, once internalized as normal, guided marriage choices for decades. Over time, what began as a practical solution became a defining feature of the family's identity. The Calderón name carried with it the memory of the sisters. Unusual union and the reality of a lineage that seemed to turn inward more tightly with each generation. Asterisk. The most striking feature of this process is how invisible it might have seemed to those living it. Each cousin marriage, each decision to stay within the family, felt like a small, practical choice. Only when viewed from the outside or across time does the pattern reveal itself as extraordinary. The Calderóns remind us that endogamy is not experienced as a grand design, but as the sum of countless intimate decisions, choices about whom to love, whom to trust, whom to marry that, when repeated over generations, create a legacy of unusual intensity. Their family tree, rather than spreading wide into distant connections, became a circle, a symbol of both unity and limitation. Asterisk. To see the Calderón sisters' shared legacy in this light is to recognize both the tenderness and the strangeness of their story. They gave their descendants not only life, but also a structure that shaped how life would continue. Through their children, their choice reverberated forward, narrowing options and intensifying bonds until their lineage stood out as singular. What began as survival became destiny, and what was once whispered as scandal became written into the very DNA of their descendants. Asterisk. As the Calderón sisters settled into their unusual arrangement and began raising children together, the effects of their choice began to ripple through the small Asturian community around them. The presence of two sisters bound to one husband was not something that could pass entirely unnoticed, and although the family did everything possible to maintain discretion, gossip was inevitable. Rural villages in 1938 Spain were tightly knit worlds, where the private lives of individuals quickly became the shared knowledge of neighbors. Every birth, every household routine, every sign of discord could be read and interpreted. In such an environment, the Calderón household could never escape commentary. But what is most striking is the way in which social consequences unfolded in layers, sometimes as gossip and moral criticism, sometimes as quiet acceptance, and sometimes as worry about the future of the family itself. Asterisk. The first reaction among neighbors would have been whispers. The idea of two sisters sharing one man was fundamentally at odds with Catholic morality and with the ideal of the monogamous family so fiercely defended by Francoist Spain. The priest could marry only one of the sisters to the man in question, so the other's role would always exist in an ambiguous, unofficial space. Villagers would have known this perfectly well, and such knowledge became fertile ground for conversation behind closed doors. Some no doubt saw the arrangement as scandalous, a threat to the moral order of the community. For them, the Calderón sisters embodied a failure of virtue, a living contradiction to the teachings that defined family and marriage. Asterisk. Yet gossip, for all its power, was not purely destructive. In small rural communities, people also learned to live with contradictions, especially when survival was at stake. Once the initial shock subsided, the sisters' household was gradually reabsorbed into the rhythm of village life. People still talked, of course, but they also recognized that the Calderón children were healthy, that the family worked its land, and that the arrangement did not spill into public scandal. The sisters were not flaunting their choice. They lived quietly, raised their children, and avoided provocation. In time, some villagers likely shifted from judgment to a kind of reluctant respect. The family may have been unconventional, but it was functional, and functionality in a time of scarcity could outweigh moral purity. Asterisk still, the consequences of gossip and moral debate left marks. Children, in particular, bore the weight of whispers. Even if they were loved within their home and recognized as Calderons by name, they grew up with the knowledge that others saw their origins as unusual, perhaps shameful. Children are sensitive to the stories told around them, and the Calderón descendants likely carried an early awareness that their family was different. Some may have been teased, others silently judged, but all would have known that their lineage was not quite like anyone else's. The sisters' decision to share a husband thus shaped not only their own lives, but also the social environment in which their children matured. Asterisk, beyond gossip, there were deeper currents of anxiety surrounding the Calderón arrangement. Even if the villagers chose not to confront the family directly, many would have worried about the implications of such tight endogamy. Local traditions already leaned toward marriages within the same community, but the Calderón case magnified these tendencies dramatically. Cousins who were also half-siblings, children who were bound by multiple lines of kinship, all of this created a family network unusually close-knit. People knew instinctively that such closeness could carry risks. Though medical science was not widely accessible in rural Asturias, folk wisdom included an awareness that too much mixing of the same blood could cause problems. Whispers about health risks, about strange resemblances among the children, about the dangers of repeating the pattern in the next generation, became part of the social narrative. Asterisk indeed, the longer the pattern persisted, the more it became a subject of moral debate. For some, the sisters' choice had been a necessary adaptation to the extraordinary circumstances of the Civil War, a practical response to scarcity and survival. But as the family grew and the generations unfolded, the arrangement came to be seen not just as a wartime improvisation, but as a defining characteristic of the Calderón line. In the eyes of outsiders, this distinction carried both fascination and unease. It gave the family a reputation, one that made it impossible for them to be fully absorbed into the anonymity of village life. To be a Calderón was to be marked by the unusual history of the sisters, and with that mark came both recognition and suspicion. Asterisk the church, too, played a subtle but important role in the social consequences of the arrangement. Officially, Catholic doctrine could never recognize such a household. Only one sister was a wife in the eyes of the church. The other remained unmarried, her children recorded as legitimate only because the community quietly chose not to raise questions. Priests, bound by their pastoral duties, would have had to walk a careful line. To denounce the family openly could have caused division in the community, yet to condone it would have been unthinkable. In practice, silence prevailed. The priest baptized the children, performed the sacraments, and maintained the appearance of order. But beneath this silence was an unspoken tension, a recognition that the Calderón sisters represented a crack in the ideal of Catholic family life that Francois Spain so loudly proclaimed. Asterisk for the sisters themselves, the social consequences must have been felt in complex ways. They had chosen a path that kept them from the isolation so many other women of their generation suffered, but it also meant accepting a life under constant scrutiny. Every visit to the marketplace, every festival, every gathering in the parish square carried the possibility of judgmental eyes or whispered comments. The sisters had to cultivate resilience, learning to ignore gossip while maintaining dignity. Their decision had given them children and companionship, but it also placed them permanently outside the boundaries of normalcy. Living in this space of quiet scandal required strength, and the Calderón sisters embodied that strength through their determination to carry on as though nothing were amiss. Asterisk over time. The social consequences extended beyond gossip and moral debate into the realm of legend. Stories about the Calderón sisters began to circulate, mixing fact with embellishment. In Asturias, where oral history carried great weight, such stories became part of the local memory. The sisters' shared husband was remembered as both a figure of practicality and of peculiarity. The children were seen as symbols of both resilience and excessive closeness. This transformation of lived reality into legend was itself a social consequence. It meant that the Calderóns would never be forgotten, that their arrangement had moved beyond scandal into folklore, a story to be told and retold, often as a cautionary tale or as an example of how necessity can twist the conventions of family life. Asterisk medical concerns added another layer to the social consequences. As generations passed and the family tree folded back on itself again and again, outsiders began to speculate about the health of the Calderón descendants. Even without formal studies, villagers could see patterns, certain resemblances repeating too strongly, certain ailments appearing with unusual frequency. Whether these observations were accurate or exaggerated by gossip, they reinforced the perception that the Calderón family had created something at once remarkable and troubling. The idea that a family could become too close, that endogamy could reach a point of risk, became tied to the Calderón name in ways that affected how others saw them. Asterisk. Despite all these consequences, gossip, moral judgment, health anxieties, the Calderón family endured. They continued to marry within their circle, to raise children, to maintain their land and their name. If anything, the very criticisms directed at them reinforced their unity. Outsiders might whisper, but inside the family, there was pride in their survival, pride in the fact that they had preserved their identity against all odds. The social consequences, then, were not only negative. They also forged a sense of collective resilience, a determination to stand together in the face of judgment. The Calderóns became, in a sense, their own fortress, bound by blood, history, and shared experience. Asterisk. The legacy of the Calderón sisters was thus shaped not only by the unusual structure of their household, but also by the way society responded to it. Gossip, debate, suspicion, admiration, and eventual legend, all of these became part of the story, part of the inheritance passed down to their descendants. The social consequences were as real as the genetic ones, shaping how the family saw itself and how it was seen by others. To live as a Calderón was to carry the weight of whispers and the strength of survival in equal measure. Asterisk. In Asturias, where the mountains hold memory as firmly as stone, and every village carries its own whispered histories, the story of the Calderón sisters eventually passed beyond the realm of lived experience and entered the space of legend. What had once been the daily reality of two women, their shared husband, and their children, slowly became a tale told by neighbors, repeated by grandchildren, and woven into the collective imagination of the region. In this transition, the Calderón sisters ceased to be simply two individuals making an unusual choice in the shadows of 1938. They became symbols, characters in a local folklore that spoke as much about community fears, survival strategies, and human adaptability as it did about their specific lives. Their household was remembered less for the details of its struggles and more for what it represented, the extraordinary lengths to which families could go in order to preserve themselves in times of crisis, and the uncanny results of such decisions. When viewed across generations, as time passed, the secrecy that had once cloaked their arrangement loosened. Children grew into adults, grandchildren were born, and the community's initial discomfort gave way to a kind of fascination. The Calderón sisters became a story worth retelling, not only in hushed tones of moral judgment, but also in the more colorful language of rural legend. In telling and retelling, the facts blurred and hardened at once. Some versions emphasized the sisters' loyalty to one another, painting them as figures of almost mythical devotion who sacrificed conventional paths in order to remain united. Others focused on the strangeness of their arrangement, casting the story as one of scandal that lingered across generations. Either way, the Calderons were remembered. Their names remained alive long after their lives had ended, preserved in the oral culture of Asturias, where memory is often as enduring as written record. What made the Calderón sisters particularly memorable was the way their story touched on themes that resonated deeply with the community. Family, survival, loyalty, sacrifice, and the tension between social norms and human necessity. These were not abstract concepts, but lived realities for the people of rural Spain, especially in the wake of the Civil War. The sisters' decision seemed to crystallize all these themes in one household. To some, they embodied the resilience of women who refused to let scarcity and hardship rob them of their futures. To others, they embodied the dangers of defying sacred tradition, a cautionary tale about what happens when boundaries are crossed. To nearly everyone, they remained unforgettable. Their transformation into legend also reflected the human tendency to mythologize what is unusual. Villages everywhere have stories of the odd family, the peculiar ancestor, the scandal that never quite died. The Calderons filled this role in their community, becoming a touchstone for conversations about morality, family, and inheritance. Parents may have used their story to warn children about the importance of following tradition, while others may have cited it as proof of the ingenuity and resilience required in hard times. The family became both cautionary tale and emblem of endurance, a paradox that only deepened its place in folklore, not in the broader narrative of Asturias, where history is full of minor strikes, rural revolts, and stories of resistance against authority. The Calderón sisters' tale took on an added layer. It became not just a family story, but a cultural story, reflecting the region's long-standing tension between rigid authority, whether of the church, the state, or tradition, and the pragmatic flexibility of ordinary people. Just as miners defied their owners and villagers, defied hunger by bending the rules of survival, the Calderons defied the strict Catholic model of marriage by creating a household that worked for them, regardless of whether it aligned with doctrine. Remembering them as legend was a way for Asturias to remember itself, stubborn, resilient, and willing to endure in unorthodox ways. The genealogical curiosity of their lineage also fed into their legend. As outsiders, researchers, and even distant relatives began to take interest in the Calderón family tree, the story took on a scientific edge. The fact that their descendants formed one of the most endogamous lineages in Spain gave the legend a peculiar legitimacy. It was not just a story told for entertainment or moral instruction. It was a case documented in records, noted by genealogists, and whispered about as proof of the dangers or fascination of excessive closeness in marriage. In this way, the Calderons moved from being a private household to being a reference point, a kind of human case study that linked science, folklore, and history together. For the descendants themselves, the legend was both a burden and a bond. To be a Calderón was to carry not only a surname, but also a story that everyone seemed to know. It meant inheriting pride in survival, but also the awkwardness of whispers about how that survival had been achieved. Some descendants likely rejected the legend, insisting that their family was no different from others, that the story had been exaggerated by gossip. Others may have embraced it, finding in it a sense of uniqueness and even notoriety. In either case, the sisters' decision continued to shape identity long after their deaths, proving that legends are not just about the past, but about how the past molds the present. What is perhaps most moving in their transformation into legend is the way it preserved their bond. In life, The Calderón sisters chose to stay together, to face judgment rather than separation, to raise children under one roof rather than let one live without family. In legend, they remain together still, remembered as a pair, inseparable. In story, as they were in life. The man they shared often recedes into the background of the tale, while the sisters stand in the foreground, their choice casting a shadow across generations. In this way, the legend honors them, even if it does so through the language of scandal or curiosity. It ensures that they are not forgotten, that their story continues to be told, that their names echo through the valleys and villages of Asturias as figures both ordinary and extraordinary. The Calderón sisters remind us that legends are not built from perfection, but from the cracks where human necessity collides with social expectation. Their household was not what doctrine prescribed, but it was what survival demanded. Over time, their willingness to live that contradiction made them unforgettable. As the decades passed and their descendants multiplied, the sisters became less flesh and blood and more symbol, their story living on in the way only true folklore does, endlessly repeated, endlessly reshaped, endlessly remembered. And so, the Calderón sisters endure, not just in the blood of their descendants, not just in the endogamous lines that fascinate genealogists, but in the collective memory of Asturias, where their names have passed into the realm of legend. Subscribe to my channel Blood Lore for more stories like this.